All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's seminar. I'm Patrick, your host. So tonight we will be going over strategies for the Common Application. So those of you not familiar, the Common App is the main application system that you're going to be using for the vast majority of your private schools and quite a few public universities as well. So let's get right into it. So first of all, before we jump into the nuances of the Common App, I kind of want to explore the current landscape of competitive college admissions. As you well know, colleges have gotten even harder, especially post-COVID, as more and more people are applying to the same top colleges, right? So many people, when they think of the top universities across the US, they think of a list kind of similar to this, which is the most recent US News rankings until at least the end of the month, right? So the 2025 rankings will be released, I think September 24th. So if you join us for a future seminar, you will see the updated list. But as of right now, these are some of the most familiar names, right? Princeton has been #1 for over a decade now. Some other schools that you're going to see here that are very familiar, Harvard and Stanford, of course, in the top three-ish. They're tied for #3. But yeah, so pretty much all the Ivies here, with the exception of Dartmouth, I believe, just didn't make the cut here in terms of the top 12. But there's a lot of representation here. Many of the schools that you heard me talk about last Friday, the Ivy Plus schools, are definitely in the mix here as well. You see MIT, Stanford, Caltech, Hopkins, Northwestern, and Chicago, right? So those are some of the same top colleges that most people are familiar with. However, there's also another rankings list of a different kind of colleges that some students and parents are not as familiar with. And I do want to talk about those a little bit, right? These are called the liberal arts colleges, right? So I think there's a lot of common misconceptions as to what a liberal arts college is, but let's maybe take a look to try to see some of the familiar names that pop in here. Some of the top ones you're probably familiar with, right? So colleges like Williams College in Massachusetts or Amherst, also in Massachusetts, are very famous at this point. Pomona College, if you're in Southern California, you're very familiar with this. Swarthmore is in Pennsylvania. It's actually in a suburb of Philadelphia, right? Along with Wellesley, which is an all-female college, also in Massachusetts, very popular and very competitive, right? And you'll also note here that the 3 service academies are listed here because not only are they, of course, very hard to get into because of all the military, I guess, requirements or the physical requirements, right? They're also very academically solid, right? Because for you to go into the Navy or the Air Force, you need a top tier STEM education, right? So that's why they're very highly ranked here as well. Some of the names further down the list you may not be as familiar with. Names like Bowdoin College or Carleton College, for instance, are a little bit less familiar to most people, right? But they're still top colleges nonetheless, and they will typically occupy the top 10 or top 15 lists of US News' liberal arts lists, okay? So some things to note for liberal arts colleges. First of all, liberal arts, by the way, is just a distinction that generally means that there's no graduate school there. Some of you might be surprised to find out that liberal arts colleges actually have just as broad a range, in some cases, as like many smaller colleges or big research universities. So that's definitely one of the main distinctions. So some of these schools, for instance, like Swarthmore, actually has a computer science and engineering program, right? So Carleton, very strong in the sciences, as is Pomona. So it's definitely something that if you've only been fixated on these big national research universities, perhaps you're missing out potentially on some of the advantages of applying to a liberal arts college. So some of the things that I see as advantages to going to a liberal arts college is that you do tend to get stronger recommendation letters, more personalized. Of course, I've seen this firsthand, right? I actually got a chance to work in Harvard's graduate school admissions office, and I was able to see the quality of the recommendation letters that come from liberal arts professors and instructors. There's a lot more nuance and there's a lot more attention being placed because you get to know your professors better in a smaller college. So that's certainly an advantage to it. Now, of course, on the flip side, you may not necessarily get big celebrity professors in their fields, right? Because most of those professors tend to gravitate towards like research universities, right? As I said earlier, many of these liberal arts colleges will have a pretty decently broad range of majors. So if you're thinking of a major that's a pretty standard major in most colleges, like if you're thinking of like psychology or thinking of an English major, and in some cases even computer science, you're actually going to be pretty well served attending a liberal arts college. However, if you're going for something that's a little bit more niche or very interdisciplinary, like you're thinking of a major like, um, let's see, computational biology, that's going to be very hard to get at a liberal arts college, right? So you're better served going to a larger research university in that case, right? Liberal arts colleges tend to make for very good preparation for graduate schools because they are oftentimes very focused on undergrad education, right? So most professors who teach at a liberal arts college will tend to do so with the intent of focusing on undergraduate teaching, not so much research. So if you feel like you'd rather have a smaller, more intimate learning environment, and you learn better by having a little bit more focus and discussion with both your peers and the professor, then a liberal arts college could actually be an outstanding preparation for graduate school. And in my experience, having seen things from, let's say, Harvard's graduate admissions office, there's not really any sort of decided difference in terms of the academic rigor involved between, like, let's say, if you attended Swarthmore or Carleton versus if you attended like a UPenn in the eyes of a graduate school admissions office, at least a top caliber one, right? So that's definitely something to consider. You're not in any sort of decided disadvantage, right? Now, of course, if what you want to study is very research intensive, then that's probably one of the trade-offs where it'd make more sense to go to a larger research institution rather than a smaller liberal arts college, okay? Another thing that's often highly underrated are public universities, okay? State schools oftentimes get like a little bit of a rap because they may not be as prestigious or kind of like fancy as some of these Ivy League type schools, but oftentimes you get a tremendous value for your tuition, right? So many of these schools like UC Berkeley, UCLA, especially if you're a California resident, the tuition is oftentimes going to be less than half of what you would pay for one of these preeminent private universities, okay? And oftentimes, if you're going to be going for fields like engineering or computer science, a school like Berkeley or UCLA will probably be just as good, maybe even better than some of these schools on this national universities list, okay? All right, so what about out-of-state public universities? What are the benefits here? As I mentioned, many public universities, especially the flagship campuses of many research universities, tend to actually be very outstanding for fields like computer science, engineering, or business, because the state governments know that that's where the jobs are, right? So they devote a lot of resources to make sure that their states excel at training their state residents to be very, very good at those fields, right? So one of the things to keep in mind here is that many big public state universities might actually be very well ranked for your specific major, but you can also benefit from maybe a better acceptance rate than if you were trying to apply to, an Ivy level or top 15, top 20, main research university, okay? The tuition in many cases will often be cheaper, especially if you're a state resident, okay? Now, even if you weren't a state resident, I would say the tuition would probably fall in between what you would pay for an in-state tuition versus what you would pay for, let's say, a private research university. So it'll probably fall somewhere in the middle there. So it's still a good value, of course, not as good as if you're a resident, okay? One of the things to keep in mind too is that if your family moved to the state where you're going to be attending for public university in about a year or two, depending on the state's regulations or the school system's, I guess, guidelines, you could actually be able to get state tuition eventually, right? That's something to consider as well down the line. And of course, networking universities. Many public universities tend to be located in the big metropolitan areas of many of these states. So there could be good opportunities for you to network, get internships, be like very well connected in terms of the job market, okay? All right, so how competitive are some of the top schools in the country these days? Have things changed? Well, what we've noticed actually is because there was a massive spike in terms of the number of applicants during the COVID era, right? What ended up happening is that since those acceptance rates plummeted tremendously, there's kind of been a little bit of a rebound in some schools. You'll notice, by the way, schools like Harvard and Brown, ever so slightly, their acceptance rate over the last 2 or 3 years has actually been increasing. Now, this is not necessarily a static trend. As you can see, like Yale and UPenn actually have an opposite trend. So it's sort of kind of fluctuating a little bit, some up, some down. So that's actually kind of good news, right? So we don't anticipate major drops because there's not really going to be an impetus for like a massive increase in the number of applications unless we had another major life-altering event like, another pandemic. Hopefully not, right? So that's a good sign, I guess, for future classes that, you're not necessarily going to see massive drop-offs, the acceptance rates for all the top colleges, right? It'll kind of vary a little bit though. Okay. All right. So let's see. Selected private schools other than the Ivies, which is what I showed you, also see a slight decrease if you're going down the trend lists here, right? So, schools like Boston College went down about 1%. Some schools didn't really change all that much, like MIT has remained more or less in that kind of like between 4 to 5% range. Some even went up slightly, actually, right? But kind of similar to the Ivies, there's not really a major trend here of the acceptance rates decreasing significantly anymore like they did in the past 3 to 4 years. Okay. All right. Let's continue. So now to the Common App page, right? So now we're going to be talking about the Common application itself. All right, so let's kind of dive deeper into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the timeline for the Common application. What is the time frame for you to submit these applications? So first and foremost, August 1 came and went already. The Common App becomes live, so to speak, on August 1st. What that means is that during the summer for a couple of weeks, they basically take it offline, right? Which means you're no longer able to access it for a couple of weeks. Now, during that time, so during that time, it goes offline, you can't access it, but August 1st comes along and they basically just do maintenance and update the actual application itself. So at that time, you would then be able to access all the different applications and be able to find the supplements for that particular year. Okay, next. On November 1st, this is going to be the deadline for most early action and early decision applications. So if you're thinking of applying early action or early decision to any of your schools, the majority of them will be due November 1st. There are a couple of notable exceptions to this. So like University of North Carolina, for example, has an October 15th deadline. The UT Austin, right? University of Texas at Austin also has an October 15th deadline. Now, beyond that, the vast majority of other schools will have a November 1st deadline. Okay. Next, November 15th is the actual deadline for University of Washington, and this is for regular decision. Okay, so just be very aware of this. This is not an early deadline. This is actually the regular deadline across the board, right? So keep in mind, because many students assume that most schools will be due around like January 1st. So if you miss that deadline, you cannot be considered anymore for University of Washington. Now, fortunately, many of the schools that you did apply to for early decision will release their decision around mid-December, I would say, right? So anywhere from as early as maybe December 8th or 9th for the earliest, all the way up to about December 20. Some even come out right before Christmas, to be honest, right? I've heard of some schools releasing their decision around December 22nd, December 23rd. Okay, and of course, that's going to be really helpful because if you get the decision during that time, you can then make any sort of necessary adjustments to your college list. If you got accepted for ED, of course, then you're done, right? So you don't have to worry about applying to any other schools because you're in. Okay, now for some other schools, if you didn't get into your EA, for example, you can hear back from, or your ED rather, you can hear back from some of your early action schools, in which case, if you got into some, you may not need as many safety schools. So that's definitely a plus for having, more than one school that you apply to for early action. Okay. All right, next is from January 1st to 8th, around that range, is usually the deadline for most regular decision schools. Now, some might even be later, right? I've seen some schools that are due even as late as January 15th, or some even like February 1st. There are going to be some schools that accept even all the way until June, but oftentimes those are going to be most likely your safeties, right? Schools that also have what's called rolling admissions, where they'll just make a decision within 2 to 3 weeks of receiving your application. So for the most part, though, the vast majority of your schools should let you know around March to April. This is the time frame by which they start kind of like revealing whether or not you got in or not. Okay. And you will then have until about May 1st to make a decision as to whether or not you want to attend the school. You will have to send in what's called your statement of intent to register at that point. Okay. Next up, why is it important to submit your application early? Okay, well, at HS2, we normally recommend that you submit your application within 2 to 4 weeks of any college deadline. And we found over the years this is really important for some reasons, right? So the first of which is it sends a signal that you're organized and that you're not a procrastinator, right? Very important. Keep in mind that the admissions people have a timestamp for when they download your application, so they know when you submitted it. So it's not going to be a good look if all of a sudden you're trying to submit it on the evening of the deadline at around like 11 p.m. Right? So that's definitely not something that would portray you in a very favorable light for the admissions people. Next is it also gives you a window of about 2 to 3 weeks during which the admissions people are in the office already, most likely getting ready for their very busy application cycle, right? And there's a huge workload that they know they're going to anticipate after the deadline, right? But in some cases, not all though, but in some cases, some admissions offices can start reading the applications early, right? So as long as they've already gotten a chance to see that there's some applications in the system, they could try to get a head start. They won't always say they do though, but that's definitely something that I've heard from some offices where they do, you know, get an early jump, I guess, in terms of reading the applications themselves. So just be aware of it, okay? And then lastly, another advantage of getting your application early is that it gives a chance for your application to make it to the interview chairs, who then distribute it to the local alumni interviewers, right? So if a school were to have an interview as part of their system, it definitely helps that you get your application in there in a timely fashion because it definitely gives you a better shot to get an interview. That's one of those like secrets that I guess a lot of people aren't aware of. That many interviews are basically kind of like on a first come first served basis, right? So many times I hear like students basically saying like, I don't get it. Like, why did my friend get an interview and I didn't? Right. And they assume that maybe they're much more interested in their friend at school rather than their application, and they get really paranoid, right? So it could just be actually that your friend just submitted their application earlier, right? So just keep that in mind. Next, what's the ideal number of college applications, right? So I just want to disclaimer everything before I jump into these talking points here that the Common Application does have a limit of 20 colleges, right? That's how many you can enter into the dashboard. And you can't add any more past that point, right? So it's important to remember that. So when you're deciding then, it's important to consider some things, right? So applying to too many schools will actually potentially dilute the quality of your efforts in writing compelling essays. So unless you started way early, it's definitely not a good idea to go ahead and have way too many schools because for some students, it just compounds your stress. It makes it harder for you to focus on certain schools. So definitely want to consider, paring it down to a reasonable number if you think you can't finish all the work. Next, you may also need to do things like interviews and visits, which could be more demanding on your schedule if you have too many colleges, right? Honestly, it may end up even annoying your school counselor, right? Who still needs to kind of like do things like send paperwork and stuff to these schools. Some schools even cap, right? I've heard of some high schools that actually cap the number of schools they allow you to apply to. So you definitely want to check on that. So we normally recommend having anywhere between 12 to 15 schools, right? So if you're applying to like a system, like the University of California, for instance, for UCs, that, you can count that as just one school technically because you're doing the same work for, if you're applying to Berkeley as if you would apply to all the UCs, right? So you do want to make sure you have a good distribution in terms of the number of colleges that you're trying for. So we want to make sure that you have ample reach schools, target schools, and safety schools in the mix as well. So, don't be too top heavy either. Don't have like 10 reach schools and only like one target school and one safety school, because then you're not going to like the results most likely, right? So you really want to have a balanced list because ideally, in the best case scenario, you're getting into about maybe half of the schools on that list, right? Because if you applied to like a certain number of schools and you got into all of them, either you're really, really lucky, which is good, or you were just maybe too complacent. You weren't trying to go beyond and try your chances for some really competitive schools, or vice versa, right? If you only got into one school, right, it probably means you really just overreached there and you were trying for too many difficult schools, and you didn't really give yourself the opportunity to have as many choices available to consider. Okay. So having more backup schools, having more target schools is good because not only can you shop around, so to speak, in terms of like finding a better situation, but you can also compare financial aid or scholarship offers, right? You could actually pay to have more schools that you got accepted to. Okay. So, and in some cases, you may even be able to compare and literally shop around. You can contact admissions offices and basically say, hey, I really want to go to your school, but this school is offering me maybe a better financial aid package. Is there anything you can do, right? So not all financial aid offices will comply or honor that request, but some do, right? If they accepted you, they kind of want you. And if you do this early enough in the process, there is some wiggle room. There is an opportunity for you to get perhaps a better financial aid situation, or maybe even be considered for some scholarships, right? Okay, next. The essay, of course, since we're talking about the application, we cannot do that without talking about the actual essays that you write on the Common Application, right? So I'd like to say that your essay is your face to the admissions office, right? So in many cases, the admissions officer never gets to meet you in person, and all they ever see of you is what is on the essay, right? So they really try to make like a secondhand, I guess, picture of you based on what you say on the essay itself. Okay, so with the relative decline of standardized testing, the essays have gotten more and more important. And like I said, this is your face to the admissions office. The college admissions process is I guess it's a very human process is what I'd like to call it, right? So these days with AI, most people think, oh, admissions is very sort of like automated, which is not, right? It's still very much a human and subjective process, right? It's more art than science, as people say, right? So there's a lot of decision making. There's a lot of talking behind closed doors. There's a lot of, basically, just, I guess, deliberation and debate even within a committee, right? So if you can really make a connection with the admissions people who are reading your file, they can advocate for you, right? They can basically say why they think you deserve to get in, right? So if you can really kind of connect with them or really impress them in the essay, it can really tremendously help your chances. Okay. Next, these are the topics that are on the Common App. It didn't really change from last year, actually, right? So interestingly enough, if you were to take a look at these, some of the more popular prompts that I think people have written about, writing about a challenge or obstacle, very popular, right? An accomplishment or event or realization that sparked your growth. That's another popular one. And of course, prompt 7 is topic of your choice, right? So these are some of the more popular ones. Now, the thing though is that admissions people don't honestly really care which prompt. These are meant as guidelines. To be honest, I've told students in the past, just write your essay. Don't worry too much which prompt you're picking, because to be honest, you can either pick prompt 7 or even prompt 1, technically. You can write on anything, right? Because you're supposed to just share your story. So any essay that you write about can honestly be made to fit a prompt 1, if you think about it, okay? So don't really worry about, oh, am I picking the right prompt? Is this the best prompt to pick, right? That's really, really not important at all, right? What's more important is you focus on the story that you want to share about yourself, and you're able to highlight certain traits or qualities that you know are going to be impressive to the admissions people, okay? Next, so this is my tip. These are my tips for how to necessarily excel in the essay portion, right? So the first one here is to think strategically, right? So a good essay highlights certain qualities or virtues that colleges seek in their incoming freshman class. So oftentimes colleges these days are very big on what they call a character, right? They want people who will add to their community, people who are ethical and outstanding, people who will be able to kind of like, really raise or elevate, the level of their community, right? So one of the things to keep in mind there is you might want to think of like, okay, so what does that mean? What can I showcase about myself that portrays me in a very favorable light? Oftentimes what I've asked students to do even is take a look at, if you looked online, there's a list of certain qualities or traits that teacher recommenders or counselor recommenders are asked to rate you on. If you're just really not sure what to focus on, that could be a good sort of brainstorming exercise to take a look at the qualities that are highlighted on that recommendation. This is when the Common App used to be submitted on paper, right? Or there was a paper version that you can download. But they still have that list online, right? So you can find that, and it'll give you a way of checking what qualities or traits that colleges are looking at, right? Next is accentuate your strengths. Take the time to assess what your strengths are and then craft an essay that highlights those strengths. Okay, so if you feel like one of your best traits is that you're very innovative and creative, right? You love building or making things, right? So try to focus that on an essay. Try to maybe uncover why you're that type of person, right? Were you a little bit of a tinkerer when you were growing up? Did you like to dismantle things, right? So maybe there's a story to say about that. Or maybe you were just a very compassionate and caring person, right? You volunteer a lot. You've always grown up like having a soft spot in your heart for people who are hurting or kind of like, down for any reason. And that's definitely something that you pride yourself on. Then, of course, build an essay around that. Really try to make sure that that highlights that aspect of who you are as a person on your essay. Okay. Next, make sure that you also strategically plan what you're going to say in the personal statement with what you might write about later on in the supplemental essays. For some of you, if you start looking at the college list, many of them may ask, oh, why are you interested in studying this major at our school? If you wrote your entire personal statement on why you're interested in your major, then in many cases, you might end up just saying the same thing for your supplemental essays. So you may want to plan it out and think of what you might say in the personal statement that's more of a character piece, something that focuses more on your overall qualities rather than, let's say, your intellectual interest in your major. I mean, you can mention that maybe if it ties into the trait or the quality that you're trying to mention, but I think it's better for you to go ahead and separate the two and make the personal statement more of personal narrative about certain qualities that you want to showcase, and then have the, I guess, the backstory for why you got interested in your major and save that for supplemental essays, of which you probably have to write quite a few, right, on depending on the number of colleges that you're applying to. Okay, but most importantly, I do urge all of you to be yourselves in this essay, right? Admissions people have gotten really good at spotting a fake, be it if you used ChatGPT or any other AI, or maybe having someone else write your essay, right? That's not a good idea. Or in some cases, it's just you trying to be someone you're not in the essay. I think that's also pretty transparent. If say, for instance, it just doesn't feel very convincing or it feels very contrived, college admissions people have gotten really adept at spotting those types of essays. Okay, so really just make sure that the essay is true to who you are. And sometimes you may want to ask people who are closest to you, right? So your parents, maybe your best friend, and try to see if when they read the essay, does this sound like you? Does this sound like the you that they've known for many years, right? So this is definitely something that you can use as a springboard for some ideas, but don't feel like you have to write what they say all the time. You do have that freedom to go ahead and write a story that you know to be true of who you are personally. Okay.